So I was trying to figure out what I would talk about or submit for a talk at Rails World this year. And a theme I've kind of been obsessed about with Rails has been like, what makes Rails feel so special? So today we're going to talk about beyond the basics and getting into some advanced Rails techniques. I'm super excited to be here again. Last time in 2023 was super special, so it's great to be back up on stage here. So let's dive in. What makes code feel Railsy? It's kind of, a nebulous topic, but I think David's talked about this several times in the past where like Ruby allows your code to feel on equal footing as the code inside of Ruby itself. Active support can extend integer class to say, 7.days and all kinds of cool things like that. And terminology is a really important piece of the Rails puzzle. When we look at things like active record, you say, has many subscribers, has one attached featured image, has rich text description, validations are really descriptive as well. And that's one of the things that is so special about Rails, and the Ruby language allows that to be possible. And this applies to our controllers too, so we can have before action authenticate user, and it just does what it sounds like it's going to do. But with Rails 8 last year, I thought the allow unauthenticated access caught my attention, and I thought that was pretty interesting. It kind of does the opposite of devise, where things are locked down to registered users or signed in users by default, and you break out of it. But instead of adding a before action that you call, it has a class method you call instead. So it doesn't actually blend in with all of the other before actions in your controller, which you might have 3 or 4 or 5 of them, and you have to read the second word to actually understand what is going on there. So these stand out on purpose a bit. And the same applies to rate limiting. Rate limiting reads extremely well. Rate limit requested this controller to 10 within 5 minutes. I love it. But what you might not realize is you can write those class methods in your code too. Typically, we're not doing that, but we absolutely can. So you might write something like this, where you have a before action, and you want to lock down this controller to admins only. And you would say, before action require admin. You'd implement that logic in a private method to require the admin. But I would propose that you could use a class method instead that stands out a bit better and say admin access only and have that be the focus. So instead of implementing the logic for this in your controller, we could extend this and put this in an authorization concern that implements a class method that just simply calls the before action right there instead. So it's an extra little layer over top of the before action, but it allows you to put better terminology into your controllers and emphasize the right stuff even more. But there's another benefit to this with class methods. They allow you to pass in arguments. So if you went to build rate limiting yourself, you might say before action rate limit, but the symbol doesn't allow you to pass in any arguments. So if these two controllers need different rate limiting settings, you'd have to build 2 different rate limit methods in those separate controllers. But if we look at how Rails implements rate limiting, it is a rate limit class method. You don't see the class method part of the concern because there's a lot of documentation in a comment above, but you see that because of Ruby having the scope of this before action and the lambda is within the method, we can reference to and within and the other options right there, and it allows us to use that and customize how it works. So why don't we go back to our admin access only method and refactor that to take advantage of those arguments. So we could say, let's move the message so you can customize it as an argument there. We can keep the other options and use that to pass along, for example, the only or if or unless or whatever as options for before action. But we can pull out our specific features as options like message here. So we could say now admin access only, get out, or I'm calling the police if somebody tries to access the admin controller instead. This also is helpful if you maybe want to redirect to a different route depending on the situation. You can pull out the route that is redirected to as an argument too. Another thing is you should not be afraid to add your own folders to the app folder in your Rails app. Here is an example that has API clients, UI components, admin resources, notifiers for notifications, maybe authorization policies like for Pundit, and active record validators. We can add folders that are part of our application and the domain it's trying to solve and organize things there. You don't have to shove things into the existing folders. You have lots of options to do that. But it feels kind of like wrong maybe at first when you're like, it needs to just fit in one of the buckets that Rails gives me. It does not. So here's an example. In our Learn Hotwire course application, we have a couple API clients. And instead of actually pulling in the gems for those APIs, we have our own custom API client. What's really nice about this is, for example, with GitHub, you purchase the course and you add your GitHub account, and we'll just invite you to the organization so you can access the source code. And we could use the OctoKit gem for that, but it implements every single API endpoint that GitHub has. We only need one. And that gem updates constantly because GitHub is changing a lot of their APIs on a regular basis. But our code doesn't have a dependency on anything else, no third-party dependencies, and we only have to implement one thing. And that's not going to change very often. So this is way, way more maintainable in the long run, which is nice. We can also build our own custom generators. So Rails ships with a bunch of generators. You might use a gem that has generators. You can put generators in your own application too. So of course, we can make a generator for API clients, and we can run Rails generate generator for API client to generate the generator. And this is super useful because out of the box, it's going to inherit from the named base generator class. And this is responsible for handling that first argument. When you run like Rails generate model or migration, you give that first argument the name of the model, and it includes a bunch of helpers on the file path for it, all kinds of different things, and I'll show you how we can use that here. So our implementation for building the generator can simply say, here's where you can find all the templates. We can add like options as well, so you can say -- URL and specify the base URL for the API, like api.github.com. And then any public methods in here will be executed, and they will take the template out of the, that directory and then copy it into the application using like the file path helper, which will also handle things like namespacing automatically for you. And that makes this really, really easy to build your own tools in your application, which is nice. And speaking of generators, you can override templates from any generator in Rails or gems as well. So for example, scaffolds typically have the notice at the top for every show action, which you probably have extracted into your application layout and have one single place for notices. So this would end up generating notices twice and displaying them twice. So you can just override this file under lib templates erb scaffold, show.html.erb.tt, just delete that line, and now your scaffolds won't do that. And you can take this further. For example, we will take like the index and we'll add pagination to it, or filtering and sorting and search. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. And then actually, rather than just like saying, yeah, we don't use scaffolds anymore, you've made them work for your team and for your application, and then it'll be all consistent, and you can keep using those features. Let's also talk about concerns. Typically, when we think about concerns, think about reusable code. So you might make a sortable module, and it adds a couple sorting functions, and this can be used in literally any model in your Rails app. But concerns can be used for organizing features. David open sourced Campfire, and one of the things that caught my attention in there was they organize parts of their models by feature using concerns, and rather than putting them in the concerns folder, they'll put them in the namespace. So when we include billing, it will first check to see if there's a user billing module, or it will fall back to looking in the top level namespace. Same with mentions. So we can go implement all of our billing code under user billing, and this is going to live in the app models user folder instead of app models concerns, because it's not reused by anybody else. But it can have all of our billing code in one place, which tends to get messy if you have it all in one file, where you might have functions and scopes and constants or whatever in various places in the file. You can put it all in one place now, and it doesn't mix together with the other features in there. Same thing goes for like implementing mentions, including the attachable module, and then maybe setting the text representation with the user's name as a default if there wasn't a caption. And you might want to vary a different one of these if you have, say, blog posts with titles. You could do the same thing, but change the implementation of the text representation. So let's take a look at an example where we'll take and use a bunch of these techniques and build a Cloudflare turnstile integration. So you might do this as your first implementation, where we need to verify a turnstile before we create the user record. And there's a couple issues with this. So first, it's kind of made your controller a bit more messy. But also, if turnstile validation fails, we haven't even attempted to validate the user. So they would fill in their stuff for turnstile. They would re-render the form with an error, but we wouldn't actually check and show any errors for the user's email or password or whatever. So then they might have to fill out turnstile like 3 or 4 times, and it would be annoying. And it would be nice if it was all integrated into the same flow. So what if we made that a concern? This, in this case, would be a reusable concern, because we could use this for any model. So we can make challenges turnstile. And the implementation for that would look something like this, where we make a module, adds a virtual attribute for the challenge token, and a validation. But we're going to make up a custom validation called turnstile and set it to true to run that. Rails will look for a class called turnstile validator, and we can implement that in our own custom folder for app validators. And then it's going to be given the record, the attribute, and the value of it, which we can send over to the turnstile API and ask the JSON response for success. Was it true or false? If it was not successful, we can add a record or an error to the record and display that in the form. So then, of course, we can use our generated generator for the generator of API clients and create that, and we just call it turnstile. That's going to then create this file, which we can add the base URI to the turnstile API. We have the secret we can look up from either environment variables or Rails credentials. Then we just need to make a post request to the endpoint, give it our secret, our token, and the optional IP address, which if we use current attributes, we don't have to also pass that along to the model. We can just reference that after we save it in the controller in a before action. So then this allows us to come back to our controller and go back to a very simple implementation. We don't have to have extra methods in here or anything. It's now handled automatically by active records validations. The only change we would do here is our sign-up params would need to permit the challenge token on that user. So we just accept another parameter just like normal. which is easy and fits the entire pattern of everything else. So turnstile now feels like assigning any other attribute, which is great. And then, of course, you can extract this out as a plugin for Rails. So we can take that concern and we can make it a little bit more modular by adding a challenges with class method that takes the service name. So then we can support turnstile, reCAPTCHA, hCAPTCHA, and all our Rails plugin would need to do is add those extra validators, and you're off to the races. And then we can use active support on load, active record, in order to make that added to Rails whenever it boots and is required and loaded. Speaking of extending Rails, a couple weeks ago, there was this post on Reddit, 70 companies you didn't know were using Rails in 2025. The first comment on there was, "Go Rails." What a surprise. And I was like, you know what? Imagine the scandal if we were using WordPress. That would be pretty funny. So I got looking at the Go Rails admin dashboard, and it got me thinking, you know, what if we took this joke too far? And of course, Tenderlove, like 16 years ago, made Fubi, which some of you guys are familiar with, that actually is a Ruby gem that compiles PHP and a C extension to talk to PHP from Ruby. I didn't bother updating that to work with the latest version of PHP, but I did wonder, what if we could just render PHP right from your controllers? So obviously, brew install PHP. Let's make this actually work, because why not? And you'd be surprised. It's these 4 lines of code. You add a renderer, you register PHP as a renderer. The options you saw in the render call, the ones for PHP will be put in the first argument there, the PHP code. The rest of it is the second argument, which we don't care about. And then we just tell Rails, we're going to return HTML in the response, and then we'll shell out to the PHP command line, just give it that PHP code. And we can open this up in our browser, and hello world from PHP works, which is awesome. And if you don't believe me, we can try PHP info, and you will see that it's running the latest version of PHP 8.4 on my Mac here, installed with Homebrew, which is great. But obviously, we got to take this joke too far, so we need to go deeper. So why not support .php templates in Rails? So in order to do that, it's helpful to understand the syntax of the file name. So we have index, which is the action name, HTML is the format, and ERB is actually the template handler, like the processor of that. So we need, obviously, index.php ERB, and we can register that stuff and make it work, of course. So in order to tell Rails that we're looking for the PHP format, we had .php, that's normally .html, of course. So we do that, we try and access that, but the Rails logs say, the hell are you talking about? You know, we don't know what that is. So one line of code, you say, you know, PHP is just an alias for HTML content. And yeah, Rails now understands PHP. So this is good. It gets us to the point where we can start processing those files. So we can register a template handler for PHP ERB files. And then it needs a callable object. It could be a Lambda. It could be a class with the call method on it. But it'll give us the template, and it will give us the source. And then what do? We need to process it, but how does this stuff work? Well, if we throw a binding IRB in there, we can look at this template variable and call identifier, and you'll see this is the full path to that file on disk. You know, my I Love PHP user on my Mac, PHP on Rails app, and so on. And if we poke around inside the Rails source code, you'll see the other handlers in there. HTML is one of them, but this is kind of weird, right? Like on line 7, instead of returning Ruby code, it's returning a string of Ruby code. So that seems weird. But what actually is happening here is this is how Ruby or Rails compiles your templates into your Rails app. So what it's doing is you're returning PHP, or Ruby code in this case, and it's going to take that and define a method so that instead of having to read from disk and evaluate the ERB file every time, it's going to evaluate it and then define a method that it can just call much quicker. So we need to go back to our template handler and then change it to return a string of Ruby code. We'll shell out to PHP to evaluate the file. We can mark it as HTML safe so it trusts the content for it or whatever, and then return that back. So let's test it out. We'll make an index.php PHP ERB file. We'll put some PHP tag to print out a paragraph in a hello world and some ERB for good measure, because we need to make sure that still works, and we can include those Ruby things in there. And we try it, and it works, sort of. The hello world gets printed out. There's a space in between, so we know our paragraph tag is actually being rendered correctly. But we still need to handle the ERB portion of this. So we can come back to our method for the handler, and we'll capture the output from PHP, and we'll just forward it along to the regular ERB processor. So we'll give it the template, but the modified source code from PHP, and voila, we have the params being printed out now as well. So now we have PHP and ERB working perfectly together, which is great. But of course, we need to make sure this works for partials and layouts and stuff too, so why not make a layout that prints out a copyright in the footer, but we'll use PHP to render the date out there. And there we go. So that's great. But why? You know, why are we doing this? Oh, I meant to delete this slide. So this is exactly how things work in common gems and everything. So index.json.jbuilder, same exact concept here. And the JBuilder gem, if you open up the Railsy, has an onload hook for action view, and it says, hey, let's register the JBuilder template handler, and we'll process that with the JBuilder handler class. And it actually also overrides the Rails templates. So Rails itself doesn't actually, the scaffolding and stuff in Rails doesn't actually support JSON, but that is added by JBuilder. JBuilder is a default gem in your gem file, so that's why you always see your scaffolds create the HTML responses plus the JSON, but it just overrides those templates as well. And it turns out, as I was looking at this, apparently I was the last commit in this folder on JBuilder, which was funny. But if you've looked at inertia Rails, this is exactly how it works. So render inertia, give it a component name for React or Vue in your props, and it's able to take your props, convert them to JSON, and serialize them, and pass them over to your React or Vue components. And if you poke around their gem, same exact thing. It adds a renderer to action controller for inertia, and then hands it off to be processed to create the response. And a lot of this, I was working on a gem recently called Ferrum PDF, where I wanted to generate PDFs using HTML and CSS, but WK-HTML to PDF is a common gem that we use for that, or have used, but it's now deprecated. There's Grover, which is great, and it talks to Chrome, like headless Chrome, using Puppeteer to export PDFs out of Chrome. The annoying part about that is it requires Node.js to be installed to have Rails talk to Node, to talk to Chrome, to talk back, and it's kind of convoluted. And I wanted Node.js. There's no in the name for a reason. And so Ferrum is a gem that you may be familiar with, but it basically implements Puppeteer using pure Ruby. So it implements the CDP protocol for Chrome, and I was like, you know, this seems like a good idea in order to build a nodeless version of exporting PDFs in Rails. And what I wanted to do was this. I wanted to be able to visit a route and have it render HTML, but then also capture the HTML, boot up headless Chrome, insert it into a new tab, export the tab as a PDF, capture the PDF, and then send it back to the browser. So when you make a request to one of these routes, we end up kind of double rendering. But we render the HTML just so that we can do that. And then what we really want to send back to the user is the PDF. So as I was working on this, what I was like, how do I do this cleanly in the controller and make it really fit into Rails? And I came up with this, which led me into all these nonsense things like render PHP. But this is how the gem works now. You can just simply say render ferrum PDF. It will actually effectively call the format HTML behind the scenes. And then you can pass in options with the curly braces for PDF specs of like, maybe you want it to be landscape mode or whatever. But then it gets the PDF back from Chrome, and we can take the extra options like disposition and file name and use those with the send data method to give the hints to the browser that, yes, we're giving you a PDF, but we'd like you to display it inline, and here's a suggested file name for it. So it ends up being really elegant and just kind of fits with Rails, and you don't even have to worry too much about calling this mod, like the class from the gem or anything like that. It's just kind of seamless. So that's about it. But obviously, Marco's been working on Herb, making ERB very HTML aware. So I'm going to need you guys to help me convince him to add PHP support to it. So not like he needs anything more to work on or anything, but I feel like we need that now. So yeah, thanks.